So Ed, we've spoke a lot about electric vehicles and traditional fossil fuel vehicles and how it's important to choose the right one for you, choose the right type of vehicle for you. And something that's always talked about is the crossover point. And there's so many different stories out there about where this crossover point is. It varies to an incredible degree, but you've done some research and had a look into why this varies and what the actual reality of this situation is.
Well, George, let's start off first explaining what the crossover point actually is. And it's the moment where the total amount of CO2 emissions for an electric vehicle, for an EV, becomes lower than it is for an internal combustion engine car, an ICE car. So when operating, an EV is obviously it has zero emissions. There's some inefficiencies in there, but overall, it's also more efficient use of energy in an EV. So this, however, has to offset the higher emissions that occur when you manufacture an EV versus an ICE car. And that's because the extraction of the lithium and the cobalt relies on fossil fuels. So an EV starts off at a disadvantage from a manufacturing standpoint, the amount of energy that goes into manufacturing those batteries. But over time, it actually catches up because it's more efficient in operation. That moment when it catches up is called the crossover point. So where the total emissions from manufacturing and operating become less for an EV compared to an ICE car. So if you go out and look at studies that have been done and talks, this number, this crossover point varies all over the place. It can be under 10,000 miles to well over 100,000 miles. There's a TED talk out there by Graham Conway. If you want to look it up, he works for the Southwest Research Institute, which, by the way, was founded by someone in the oil business. But in his talk, he's throwing out numbers that are over 200K. And then there's counter videos out there to try and counter and explain that, oh, no, that's way too high. I even saw a clip this week where a senator was questioning our Secretary of Transportation, Peter Buttigieg, here in the United States, and they were throwing these numbers around. So it's political, it's technical, and it's highly dependent on several factors. And the value that you assign to these factors will change where that crossover point is. So what I'll try and do here in the next few minutes is try and explain what these factors are so you can come to an understanding of what you think that proper crossover point might be for you. So I mentioned manufacturing emissions. This is an area where there seems to be somewhat an agreement, and we'll use metric tons of CO2. For an ICE car, that's roughly 5 metric tons. If you have a 150-mile range EV, it's around 9, so it goes up by 4. And if you double that mileage to 300-mile range, it goes up to about 13 metric tons to manufacture. So that's your starting point. You basically have to make up the difference of 4 metric tons for the 150-mile range EV, or 8 if you've got a 300-mile range EV, over the operational time of the vehicle. All right. Now, what do those emissions look like for an internal combustion engine car? That depends to a great extent on the mileage that car can get. So in the US, we're roughly on average about 25 miles per gallon, where elsewhere in the world, that can go up to 35 to 40 miles per gallon. If we look at that in terms of the amount of CO2 that's emitted, it's roughly 300 grams per mile for a more fuel efficient car to roughly 400 grams per mile for a car in the USA. So that's so you can see that depending on how big the car is, they're going to be emitting more or less grams of CO2 per mile. On the electric side, that's where things get really, really interesting, because if you're using solar power or hydropower, then you have a very, very clean zero emission energy, and it's pretty much zero emissions throughout the entire life of an EV. However, that's not how electricity is generated. You can use coal, you can use natural gas and other sources, and depending on the mix, you're going to change what the emissions are per mile for an electric vehicle, depending where that energy comes from. So coal roughly emits about a kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated. Gas is half that. So 500 grams or half a kilogram per kilowatt hour. Now, in the US, 60% of the energy comes from fossil fuels, and 40% is gas and 20% is coal. Globally, it's roughly still 60% from fossil fuels. However, it's a bit of a flip. 40% is from coal and 20% is from natural gas. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, only 40% is coming from renewable sources like nuclear, wind, hydro, that type of thing. So if you average this all out, it's roughly globally around 500 grams per kilowatt hour globally and roughly 400 in the US. There's some inefficiencies, even in an EV, in how it utilizes that. That number can vary too. I've picked 77% efficient for an EV, and that puts you at about globally 600 grams per kilowatt hour and 500 grams in the US. All right. So that's really going to impact the amount of emissions per mile. And then depending on how many miles you drive in a year, that's going to impact how long it takes to actually get that crossover point. And I'm going to use 12K miles per year, 12,000 miles a year. So we'll start off here to look at the results. Now I'm going to assume that a 150-mile battery, car with a 150-mile range, that battery has a difference of about 4 metric tons of CO2 for manufacture, and the 300-mile range EV has about 8. So we have to make up for the 4 and the 8 metric tons by being more emitting less emissions operationally. Now, if we look at the CO2 that you emit over those 12,000 miles, depending if you have the large or the small ICE car, you go from about 3.5 to 5 metric tons per year. And on the EV, we depending on the mix of fossil fuels you have, say US versus global, it's anywhere from 1.7 to 2. So 3.5 to 5 for an ICE car, and roughly in that 2 metric tons per year for an electric vehicle based on the global mix of how that energy is created, coal, gas versus completely clean. So the end result, let's assume you're 100% zero emissions, all right? So that's the best case for an EV. And if you compare against a 150-mile range EV versus a lower mileage car, like a larger car, that crossover point is roughly 10,000 miles or maybe even less. So that's a 150-mile range on the EV versus a fuel-efficient car that's roughly getting 25 miles per gallon, an ICE car. Worst case would be the larger EV at 300 miles range versus a higher mileage small car that could say 40 miles per gallon. That number now, that crossover goes up to about 25K. So for perfectly clean, zero emissions electricity generation, 10 to 25K. At the other end of the spectrum, and this is where the high numbers come from, is coal. Now, even though coal is dirty, generating electricity from coal is still more efficient, roughly 33%, versus generating energy from gasoline, which is only 20%. So in this case, in the best case here, 150-mile range EV versus the low mileage ICE car will get you a crossover point of about 40K. But if you go to the higher range EV versus a small fuel efficient car, it goes to well over 100K miles. So that's where you're getting these big differences in some of these studies. So a coal fire versus clean is roughly 4 times higher crossover point than if you if you compare the zero emissions to coal. Now, if we use the global energy mix for this, right, and then it'll put you somewhere in between those. Best case, 150-mile range EV versus a lower mileage large car, crossover point of roughly 20K. And if we go with the worst case, very fuel efficient gasoline car versus the higher range EV at 300 miles, it's roughly 50K. So that's about 2 times what your crossover point is versus the complete zero emissions. So 10 to 25K for zero emissions for the crossover point, 40 to well over 100K if we look at coal only. But if you look at the true global energy mix, that crossover point, depending on what your range is in your EV versus the mileage that you have in your ICE car, you're in that 20 to 50K range. So if you assume at 12K per year or whatever your mileage might be, that's roughly 2 to 5 years, say, an EV is going to be better. And if you assume that the life of a car is 10 to 15 years, then truly over the lifetime of these vehicles, an EV is going to be much more, the emissions from an EV will be much lower than they will be from an ICE car. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of where this big variation in CO2 emissions is coming from. And, we can certainly provide some of the references here that were used to come up with these numbers. And you can draw the conclusion that best fits how you use your car and where you're getting your energy.
That's fascinating, Ed. Like, this is why I love talking to you. I genuinely learn something new every single time we have one of these chats. And there's a few takeaways I've got before. I mean, we used to call this show 5 minutes, but we've gone well past that. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This is a good conversation. It's an important one as well because it applies to pretty much everybody, anybody with a car, anybody with transportation needs. The takeaways I get from that is that it seems like the most important differentiating factor for when this crossover point is how you get your electrical energy. That seems to be the biggest one because that's when you get the crazy
Absolutely.
numbers over 100,000 miles for the crossover point. And the other thing is that it's a very complicated thing to figure out. It feels like there should be somewhere where you can do this. You shouldn't need to sit down like you have and calculate things of all these formulas and plot on a graph and stuff like it. It should be a simple things for consumers to be able to find out, but it's not simple at all.
Well, there actually are some websites that allow you to plug in some of these different numbers and they'll magically give you an output that come close to some of the numbers I've had here. They don't explain exactly the rates that they're using, but for the USA, for instance, there is a site that'll do that for you, and it'll start to put you in the ballpark where you would enter what's the current fuel economy of your ICE car, how many miles do you drive per year, and then it roughly compares the amount of emissions for the two. But you're absolutely right. Depending on which article you read, unless you want to take the time to sort of dig in and ask questions about, well, how exactly did you come up with this? It can be a little bit hard to get to the facts. But in the end, the direction that we're headed, certainly by having more clean energy generation, the EV in the long run is definitely going to reduce the amount of CO2 emissions.
Yeah, and that's the other thing as well. You've got an ever-changing landscape. It's always changing all the time. I know there's some big changes on the cards in the UK that have been planned for how we generate our energy, and I'm sure it's the same for pretty much every single developed country out there. They're all looking to change things and get greener and cleaner, basically. But yeah, like Ed alluded to there, we will. If you're listening to on YouTube, I'll put all the links to the references in the description. If you're on something like Microsoft Start, I will probably just give a list. I will not be able to put links because that's not allowed on that platform yet. So hopefully in the future we'll be able to get that. But yeah, I'll probably put a list of some of the more prevalent references there for the things that Ed was talking about. But yeah, if you've got any more suggestions for anything you want us to talk about, Ed's a former head of VP motorsports at Siemens. He's a very good source of knowledge, as he's just demonstrated, and has demonstrated for all the videos we've done so far together. Send us a question in. We're always up to answer anything to do with motoring or motorsport. And yeah, keep it tuned to the motoringchronicle.com for much more content just like this. Ring the bell, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. See you soon.